So I just wanted to say a few words of thanks and acknowledgement and about the inspiration for this program. First off, my deepest thanks to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and to the museum at Eldridge Street for co-presenting this program with us. And this has been a rich collaborative project. My thanks to Jonathan Brent at YIVO, and especially to Helena Gindi, who did a lot of the heavy lifting for this program, to Bonnie Diamond and Amy Stein-Milford and Hannah Griff-Sleven at the museum at Eldridge Street for partnering with us. The Eldridge Street Synagogue, where the funeral of Mendel Beilis took place, allowed us and encouraged us to really take this into America and to offer perspective on this event from multiple perspectives. So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our participants who will be introduced, and especially to the New York Council for the Humanities for generously supporting this program. I'd also like to acknowledge, since this is a program that has attracted people from many different perspectives, we have in the audience this evening Jay Beilis, the grandson of Mendel Beilis, and I've just met Mordechai Beilis, a descendant of Mendel Beilis. So this really is a family affair, and we welcome you here. And if there is some perspective that you want to offer and discussion during the question period, I think that would be wonderful. The trial of Mendel Beilis took place in Kiev from September 25th through October 28th, 1913. So it ended just a little over 100 years ago today. 100th anniversary is both a purely ceremonial, superficial mark, but I think it is also a significant mark, an anniversary that allows us to gauge, mark, celebrate, question the impact, the legacy of key events. And that is what this program is intended to do from the perspective of multiple viewpoints, scholars, and discussion, offering a range of perspective on both the life and the impact of this remarkable event. At Yeshiva University Museum, we explore essential characteristics and abiding values at the core of the Jewish experience. Through artistic, textual, visual, and material culture, we bring to life the beauty, dynamism, and creativity of Jewish ideas and tradition across the generations. And a program that both marks the changes, what has happened in 100 years, what we have learned, is something that goes both to our essential mission and to what we do here at the Center for Jewish History. I wanted to mention just a couple of exhibitions, one that we just opened around the Ben Ezra Synagogue of Cairo, which I invite you to come back and experience here on this floor, Threshold to the Sacred, the Ark Door of Cairo's Ben Ezra Synagogue. And we'll be opening in a few weeks a special exhibition called Light and Shadows on the story of Iranian Jews. So this is in some ways the Sephardi or Mizrahi season at Yeshiva University Museum, and we invite you to come back to experience our exhibitions. So I'd like to invite Jonathan Brent, who will introduce the speakers, and we hope you enjoy the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. I want to also thank the Yeshiva University Museum for this program and Eldridge Museum. I want to thank the speakers, and I want to thank you all for coming. It's a most important evening of commemoration. The song, which you will hear eventually, I am certain, as soon as we can locate our creative artists this evening, was actually found in a book, Song of Generations, Pearls of Yiddish Song, that was edited by Hanem Lotek, our beloved music archivist who died this morning. And so, in a way, I would like to dedicate this program to Hannah. Hannah worked at the YIVO Institute before many of us were born. She started in 1944. She was a secretary to Max Weinreich. And throughout her long and extraordinary career, she developed the greatest scope of knowledge of anyone living of the history of East European Jewish music. Her knowledge was truly encyclopedic. She helped scholars hundreds and hundreds of thousands of scholars over many generations with their research, with the books that they were writing, and with people who simply had questions about songs that they had heard in their childhood. For instance, I grew up with a song that my grandfather had claimed, or my father had claimed my grandfather had invented, a very funny sort of bawdy song. And so I sang it for Hannah in my first week of coming to the YIVO Institute, and she said, "Well, I believe that was on the Yiddish stage in 1919. And so this was the sort of mind that she had. We shall be treated to a wonderful musical rendition of Lied von Mendel Beilis, performed by Elissa Gutkin and Lorin Sklamberg.
Wie halt men das Eis, der Jid fragt verwundert, sein edler Mäuer kann das nicht verstehen. Bei der jetzigen Zeit, im 20. Jahrhundert, als min red sicher soll kennen geschehen, Theologen gelernte, sie begreifen das kann, mit scharfe Protesten, sie treten heraus, gegen den Bibel von alles da. Sie schreien, sie fragen, wie halt man heraus? Als dort in Kiew die schwarze Chavrose, gemeine Verbrecher, sie täten das Kind. Mendel Beilis schuldig, im Waffen men entwiese, und im klagt men an in der schreckliche Sinn, zu machen a Bibel von alles Damm. Die Tyrann Samislavski tret Chutz Bisharois, kedei auf Herzen na wilden Pogrom. Wie halt men das Eis, wie halt men das Eis, zu seinen Gericht die Teinesheus zu hören, von dem Rosche Wippe, dem Prokuror, in die Augen sich stellen, heißblutige Tränen, zu sehen, das Falschkeit von dorten geht fort. Wir sucht zu vertummeln jedes ähnliche Wort, was die Ehrlichkeit ist, sagen dort uns, zu beweisen als Beilis ist schuldig in dem Mord. Wie halt man das aus, wie halt man das aus? Wer es hat nicht dem Mörder, dem wilden Rotzeher, dem Jid, was durch nur Christlichen Blit, der Rücken gebeugen, das Ponnen wisst unbleich, der Stempel von dem Goles, der erschlagen hier, guckt wie verzählt zu dem Sonne im Kegen, als if's von dem Herzen im Reis sich heraus, seine trockene Lippen Scheile sie fragen, wie halt man das aus, wie halt man das aus? dort in der Zwisse, in a finsteren Cheder, in den schwarzen Paruches kommt die Nacht. Dort sitzt Mendel Beilis, verkimmert geseder, noch sein Weib und Kinder, bängt und schmach. Das lässt ihm nicht ruhen, das lässt ihn nicht schlafen. Weint still und bett, Gott, helf mich heraus. Genug schon zu viel, Gott, tust du mich strafen. Ich halt es nicht stolz, ich halt es nicht stolz. Schönen herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very, very much, Lorin and Lisa. It's now my pleasure to introduce to the lectern Elissa Bemporad, a real friend of YIVO, a researcher in our library, a scholar who's been with us on many occasions. Elissa.
Good evening. So I will be speaking about the trial that has been referred as the Anti-Semitic Trial that shook the world, meaning the trials of Mendel Beilis, which took place more or less 100 years ago in September and October of 1913, and which ranks along the Dreyfus affair and the Dreyfus trial in France as one of the most notorious trials in modern history. It was the result of the intervention of the high echelons of the Russian government with the support of the Ministry of Justice, and it was fueled by the reactionary and monarchist elements in Russian society. Finally, it happened at a very critical time in Russian history, intersecting with political upheavals and passions, as well as with fears connected to modernity and the dread that modern times meant the end of established and familiar patterns of life. So my goal here is really to cover the most salient moments in the history of the Beilis trial, and at the same time to discuss the nature, which in many ways was unique, of late imperial Russian anti-Semitism. So it all began on March 20th, 1911, when the body of 12-year-old Andrei Yushchinsky was found in a cave in the outskirts of Kiev, near a brick factory where Mendel Beilis worked as a superintendent. After the boy's funeral, members of the ultra-nationalist and right-wing and anti-Semitic Black Hundreds distributed leaflets claiming that the boy had been the victim of a Jewish ritual murder. After all, Jews used the blood of Christians Christian children to mix with their Passover matzahs. And the pamphlet called for a pogrom and called for revenge. Avenge the unhappy martyr. It is time, was the plea on the pamphlet. And by the way, this pamphlet also resembled those pamphlets distributed at the time of the pogrom that some of you might have heard of, the pogrom of Kishinev in 1903 and other pogroms that took place during the First Russian Revolution of 1905. The right-wing press and some politicians soon called attention to the case, and top-level government officials became involved. As I mentioned, the Ministry of Justice primarily. The initial police investigation clearly linked the murder to a criminal gang associated with a woman by the name of Vera Chibiriak. The boy was probably murdered by members of the criminal gang because he overheard information related to the crimes that the gang committed. but the investigators in charge who had made this link were dismissed, and the Kiev district attorney prosecuted the case as ritual murder. Mendel Beilis was consequently arrested on July 11th and indicted for ritual murder. He spent 2 years in prison in horrific conditions. After postponements by the prosecution lasting over 2 years, which really reflect this almost desperate attempt to patch together a believable indictment in a case that blatantly lacked in evidence, Beilis was finally brought to trial in the fall of 1913. Reporters from most of the major nations of the world attended the trial. The courtroom was packed with approximately 1,000 people, including a large contingent of high-ranking officials, military men. At the time of the trial, just to give you a sense of what was going on, 200 prominent intellectuals in Germany signed a protest manifesto against the trial of Beilis. Among the signatories was Thomas Mann. Similar manifestos appeared in Great Britain and in France, and of course in Russia, with a manifesto signed by leading personalities in the arts, sciences, and even politicians, with 64 members of the Duma, of the Russian parliament. So with this national and international attention, with official protests from both Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals, it would be a mistake to assume that Russian public opinion and Russian society as a whole was unanimously convinced by the accusation. I just want to draw our attention to this point. The Russian public opinion was rather evenly divided. There were socialist voices, liberal voices, and even some conservative Russian voices that rallied to Beilis' defense. Even some conservative nationalists spoke against the accusation and argued that the ritual murder charges against Beilis reflected shame upon Mother Russia and not the Jews. Both legal teams included attorneys and public figures. The prosecution included some of Russia's leading anti-Semitic activists, while Beilis' defenders included a number of eminent Jewish and non-Jewish lawyers. I just want to mention the name of Oscar Grusenberg, the foremost Jewish criminal lawyer of his generation, who had defended many Jews and non-Jews for alleged crimes against the government, and among them were also, such important intellectuals and writers such as Maxim Gorky and such an important figure at the time as Leon Trotsky. Without dwelling on too many details about the trial, allow me just to recount 2 moments that seem significant in capturing the atmosphere that surrounded the trial and also the clashes between prosecution and defense. First, the prosecution attempted to provide scientific respectability to the ritual murder accusation. This is perhaps the last time in history, among the many cases of ritual murder trials, that we see this attempt. And in order to do so, the prosecution called on professors and other kind of distinguished or pseudo-distinguished voices in Russian society, Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Kiev University, and also a priest, a Catholic priest who was called to testify as the chief witness and alleged expert on Jewish religious practices, Justin Pranaitis, who would testify that Andrei Yushchinsky, the little boy, was indeed murdered. I mean, this was a classic example of ritual murder committed in conformity with Jewish law, and he had, this whole theory about the dogma of blood. And not only did he point to the fact that the Talmud, encourages Jews or orders Jews to engage in this ritual, but it's also in the teachings of the Kabbalah. It is interesting to consider how the Beilis defense team reacted to this attempt. The first response was to turn to the Vatican, which is actually a traditional response in Jewish history, and it sought an official document confirming papal refutations of the blood accusation against Jews in order to disprove the testimony that the so-called religious expert Pranaitis, who had argued that the papal statements the Pope had made such statements since the 12th century, since the first case of ritual murder, that the papal statements absolving Jews of ritual murder accusations were actually forgeries. A number of professors representing Russia's foremost academic institutions and Rabbi Yakov Maze of Moscow asserted very clearly that the spilling of human blood was contrary to the teachings of Judaism. Ironically, and this is also an interesting piece to the puzzle, is that the greatest obstacle in proving that Beilis murdered Andrei Yushchinsky in order to collect blood for matzos entailed, first of all, demonstrating that he was an observant Jew, a fanatically observant Jew who performed services like getting Christian blood for other observant Jews. But this proved quite difficult since Beilis was not an observant Jew. The second point that I want to make about the trial itself, I would like to read an excerpt from the closing argument of the state prosecutor, Oskar Viper. And the following statement really captures not only growing anti-Semitism in late imperial Russia, but also its distinctive nature. So I'm quoting here. "I feel impelled to say openly that I find myself under Jewish domination, that I am weighted down by the power of the Jewish press. The Russian press is only marginally Russian. The fact is that practically all organs of the print media are in Jewish hands. Having monopolized the press, they've become so arrogant as to believe that no one will dare to level such an accusation against them, not only in Russia, but in other countries as well. They have the wealth. They are, in fact, the rulers of our universe. What is not fictitious, but a matter of historic record," he's referring to the blood libel, "is that ritual murders did occur, and the circumstance in those cases strongly resembled those of the features of the case before us," end quote. So what we see here is this quintessential modern fear of the powerful international jury, which coalesces quite harmoniously with what could be deemed as a quintessential medieval form of anti-Semitism based on the blood legend. October 28, 1913, the verdict was read, and it's a very ambiguous verdict. While the jury found that Beilis was innocent, it also allowed for the possibility that a ritual murder had, in fact, taken place. So this is the question that is asked to the jurors. Is the accused Mendel Beilis guilty of having entered into collusion with others who have not been discovered in the investigation in a premeditated plan prompted by religious fanaticism to murder the boy? If I had a PowerPoint, that would be underlined. The answer of the jury, no, not guilty. So the question addressed to the jury was framed in such a way as to leave the religious motivation of the crime unaffected by the verdict. This was an important victory for the prosecution, since it had been proved in court that a ritual murder had occurred. Even if Beilis had not committed it, the wording implied that it was a Jewish crime. One of the questions that historians have asked is, how much did this case represent a conscious conspiracy of the government? Was there a plan reaching the Tsar to convict Beilis of ritual murder? After all, we know from archival material that the jury was rigged and monitored, and some witnesses were bribed, threatened by officials. Of the 12 jurors selected to decide Beilis' fate, 7 were members of the Black Hundred. But the evidence to support charges of a full-fledged government conspiracy are ultimately weak. And it seems that there was no grand design, but rather there were conspirators, government officials at the higher levels involved in orchestrating the case, who hoped to please Tsar Nicholas II. The blood libel was consequently used as a convenient political weapon to divert the attention of the masses, blame the Jews, and perhaps even weaken the left. It might be that these officials hoped that the case would discredit the left-wing opposition, especially when the Duma had voted, the Russian parliament had voted several months earlier in February 1911 to consider abolishing the Pale of Settlement. In the years 1894-1917, the years of Nicholas II, Tsarist authorities grew ever more suspicious of their Jewish subjects. They saw the hand of the Jews in the revolutionary activity, but also in Russia's foreign policy disasters, most notably the Russian-Japanese War of 1904-1905. The trial grew out of a specific socio-political context, I would argue. For 3 decades, the Russian government had pursued a reactionary course in its Jewish policy. It was the Russia of the pogroms of 1881, 1903, 1905, and 1905-1906. We have approximately 600 pogroms. In many instances, the lack of intervention on the part of the police and military. Between 1905 and 1916, the government authorized the printing and dissemination of more than 14 million copies of some 3,000 anti-Semitic books and pamphlets. The Tsar himself contributed over 12 million rubles from his private fortune toward the publication of such literature, including the classic work, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The fact that the trial proceeded as long as it did, when there was evidence of Beilis' innocence, confirmed that the Russian government had become the best ally of the anti-Semitic and chauvinist forces at the time in Russia. It is true that the acquittal of Beilis was a blow for the Tsarist government and its policies, and a cause for triumph and joy for Jewish and liberal circles. But overall, the whole Beilis affair also contributed to a general feeling of dejection among Russian Jews in the years preceding the war and the revolution. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Robert Weinberg, who is professor of history at Swarthmore College. Robert.
Okay. As someone who does not own a smartphone, I will see if my PowerPoint works. Okay, you're not supposed to see all that. Okay, I use a Mac, so I'm not sure how to get out of that one. Okay, there it is. Okay, slideshow. Thank you. Okay. Anyway, I would like to thank Jonathan for inviting me, and for Yeshiva University Museum for helping host this event. I've been asked to speak about sort of responses to the Beilis trial in the United States, in Russia. And before I start, I just wanted to follow up with something Elissa said about the prosecution trying to prove or demonstrate that Beilis was a fanatical Jew. I don't know of any observant Jew who works on a Saturday, the day that the boy went missing. So, you know, they were grasping at straws, but nonetheless, enough people would believe that Beilis was actually guilty. I think it's fair to say that if Mendel Beilis lived today, he'd be a very wealthy man. He would have the paid interviews. He'd have other money-making events that celebrities command. He'd be on every television talk show, and no doubt his story of 2.5 years in prison would be a bestseller, and it'd probably be a made-for-TV movie. So what I'm suggesting, it's hard to exaggerate that among the reading public, especially Jews in North America and the Russian Empire in Europe, knew the tragic story of Mendel Beilis. For Jews everywhere, the trial of Beilis was a collective tragedy for the Jewish community, much more than the persecution of an individual manager of a brick factory, which that's what Beilis did for a living. Beilis was a public figure, a celebrity whose face was known among the informed reading public throughout Europe and the United States. And This is a picture of a postcard from 1920, and it shows Beilis in the middle, and on the left, yes, is Rabbi Mazza that Elissa mentioned before, and on the right, Oscar Grusenberg, the preeminent Jewish lawyer, criminal lawyer of the time that Elissa also mentioned. Beilis, at the time, realized the importance of his ordeal. He knew the case was not only about himself, he chose not to commit suicide while in prison, so anti-Semites could not claim that only a guilty person kills himself. He also refused to capitalize on his ordeal. In general, his fame and celebrity did not sit well with him. No exaggeration to state that the story of Beilis remained in the forefront of Jewish consciousness well into the 1930s, only to be supplanted by the Holocaust as the defining moment of anti-Semitism during the first several decades of the 20th century. Not surprisingly, the Jewish response in the Russian Empire, Europe, and the United States was fairly clear and consistent. Outrage and condemnation of the tsarist regime, which already had a well-deserved reputation as anti-Semitic. Prominent Jewish individuals, as well as Jewish community organizations, responded in a variety of ways, from issuing public statements, signing petitions, and raising money for Beilis' defense. It took advantage, many of these organizations took advantage of the opportunity to implore their governments to condemn the government of Tsar Nicholas II. Lesser known is the rash of plays about Beilis that dominated Yiddish theater and first appeared in theaters large and small in New York, and then spread to other cities in the United States, Canada, and England in the 2 months after the trial. So we're sort of talking from late October through December 1913. The streetcar on our street ordinarily stopped 2 blocks from our house. This time, however, somebody had a signboard rigged up in front of my house reading Beilis Station, and the streetcar brought guests by the thousands. Okay? There were also Russians and other Slavic inhabitants of the empire who could be considered solid anti-Semites, but nonetheless acknowledged that hard evidence of Beilis' guilt just did not exist. Conservative and hardcore nationalists in their political views and staunch defenders of the autocracy, these people believed that Yushchynsky had been the victim of ritual murder, though not committed by Beilis. Moreover, some may have even believed that the blood libel was an entirely bogus accusation in the case of Yushchynsky's murder, but nonetheless entertained the notion that it is possible that Jews engaged in ritual murder, but just not in this case. And I remember a letter I read from a progressive Jew from Odessa who argued that I know among my co-religionists in Odessa, since we are progressive, we do not engage in such behaviors, such as ritual murder. However, I can't vouch for what my co-religionists up in the northwest of the Pale may do. So there's some distancing going on among the Jewish community in Russia. A prime example of what I just mentioned in terms of anti-Semitic or nationalist non-Jews taking the side of Beilis is the case of Vasily Shulgin, an editor of an important conservative newspaper in Kiev, and that newspaper never took the side of the Jews. But Shulgin broke ranks with his fellow conservatives when he condemned the trial as a sham based on no evidence. And it seems that Elissa and I look at the same materials. Great minds think alike. As Shulgin wrote in his memoirs, one I cannot help feeling ashamed for Russian justice as a whole. To convict a Jew of ritual murder in the face of such paltry evidence was not only unethical, but stupid. And it is useless to plead stupidity and say it was not we who disgraced themselves before the world. Shulgin was proud of his anti-Semitic credentials, but in this instance he believed that the effort to railroad an innocent man would harm the reputation of the monarchy. And since he expressed his views in an editorial, charges were lodged against him. He was found guilty of disseminating false information because he criticized the prosecution. He was sentenced to a short prison term, but the Tsar decided to pardon him, so he didn't really have to spend any time. Then there were the rabid anti-Semites, the notorious Black Hundreds who mobilized politically in order to bolster the rule of Nicholas II by attacking Western values and ideas such as constitutionalism, parliamentary democracy. They saw all of this as a threat to the Christian foundations of imperial Russian society and culture. In their minds, Jews were responsible for all the ills of not only Russia, but the Christian world in general. And it was the religious strictures of Judaism that obliged or compelled Jews to engage in behavior designed to achieve world domination and oppression of non-Jews. In addition, Judaism was behind the ritual killing of Gentile youth, so Jews could use their blood in a variety of religious rituals, and in particular in terms of baking matzah at Passover time. Immediately after Yushinsky's body was found, anti-Semitic forces in Kiev began to label the killing a ritual murder and demand that local authorities devote their energies to finding the Jew or Jews responsible for the murder. They convinced a local judicial investigator who then launched the conspiracy to frame a Jew while allowing the murderers to go free. And it was the anti-Semites, and most likely the woman, the head of this gang of thieves that Elissa mentioned, who identified Beilis as the target and began to manufacture the narrative that found its way into the indictment, stating that Beilis and a group of unknown Jews conspired to murder Yushinsky for the purpose of draining the blood from his body. Now, keep in mind, logic plays no role in the worldview of the extreme anti-Semitic person. Just think about the obvious. I mentioned Beilis. If he's an observant Jew, why is he working on the Sabbath? If Jewish communities throughout the Russian Empire, Eastern and Western Europe and North America required Gentile blood every year at Passover time, you would think that there would have been tens of thousands of reports of missing children since the Middle Ages when the accusation first emerged. Of course, that did not happen, but that doesn't matter in their mind. And here's a political cartoon. I like collecting these kinds of anti-Semitic political cartoons. And it's written in Russian and Yiddish at the bottom, and a loose translation is, "Look, Yosel, this is Beilis." And if you look closely, there is Beilis sitting on a throne. That's Beilis written around his head. In the right hand, he has a knife, and in the left, he is holding a piece of matzah. There are Jews bowing down in front of the idol, right? And there's a grandmother and a grandson who is pointing out to the grandson that this is the famous Beilis. And you can see the boy is eating a piece of matzah. And these kinds of caricatures were very common at the time. So the depiction of Jews in these newspapers should not surprise us. There was nothing new in the way they depicted Jews in terms of having large noses and so on and so forth. I want to end by showing you two photographs quickly. This is the grave of Andrei Yushinsky in Kiev, the dead boy who was murdered. Sometime around 2005 or so, extreme nationalist, anti-Semitic patriots decided to put up a shrine to the martyr Yushinsky. And so they had a piece of marble inscribed with some of the material from the indictment saying that Beilis, that the boy had died from some 4 stab wounds, that he was a martyr, a victim of a systematic attempt to drain his body of blood. They put up a cross, and every year on the anniversary of his death, they meet, and I imagine they talk about all the evils Jews are responsible for in the world today. And here's another image of it. You can see they built a canopy over the grave to protect it. And I assure you it is the largest grave in the cemetery there, but it didn't stop me from walking past it 10 or 15 times before I realized what it was. It just didn't register on me. So I want to finish my remarks now and say that Beilis still makes it into the news today. If not Beilis, ritual murder, especially in political cartoons in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well. There are always references to ritual murder, and it's all part of an effort by groups in the Middle East, in the Russian Empire, Ukraine, to disparage the Jews and to promote policies that would sort of hurt Israel in world opinion. In fact, a few years ago, there was a report in Swedish television and newspapers saying that the Israeli army was selling body parts for ritual purposes. So that got reported, and that's in Sweden. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I just wanted to end with that. Anyway, thank you for your time.
Our next speaker is Annie Polland, who is Vice President of Programs and Education at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum.
So I'll just find my PowerPoint. It's wonderful to be back at the Center for Jewish History. Okay, so ignore the man in the corner and look instead on the street. When Mendel Beilis died, he died in New York. He actually died in Saratoga Springs, but he was a resident of the Bronx. But when he died, his funeral was on the Lower East Side of New York, and it began in Zion Memorial Chapel here, which is pictured on the right, and you can see Canal Street. And the funeral procession made its way from this chapel just about 3.5 blocks to the Eldridge Street Synagogue. And I want to talk tonight a little bit about his funeral and pause as I go through the description of the funeral to put his funeral and his death and his life in the context of a changing New York City and a changing Lower East Side and a changing Eldridge Street Synagogue. So this description that I'm going to read is culled from a variety of sources, from the Yiddish press and the American press. But I'm doing this to give you a picture of this funeral. Promptly at 2, and this is July 9th, 1934, the body was brought to the synagogue from the Zion Memorial Chapel. The hearse made its way through the streets of the East Side with a large throng following, while windows of nearby houses were crammed with the curious. Groups peered down from roofs of tenements. As it made its way to Eldridge Street itself was crowded with thousands of people. The New York Times said it was thronged with people. Some sources said that there were 4,000 people. Some said that there were 3,000 people. The people stormed Congregation Kahaladat Yeshurin, Anshe Loops, which is the Eldridge Street Synagogue, at 12 Eldridge Street, to pay their last respects to Mendel Beilis in one of the largest funerals witnessed on the streets of the Lower East Side. Soon after noon, people began pouring into Eldridge and Canal Streets from all parts of the city. A detail of policemen from the 5th Precinct under the supervision of Sergeant John Gallo maintained order. Repeatedly, the crowd attempted to gain entrance into the synagogue, but police prevented, as the synagogue was not yet open to the public. Hats were crushed as the milling mob surged up the stairs of the synagogue as the building was opened soon afterwards. A woman fainted and was quickly revived. you don't really have a funeral on the Lower East Side unless a woman faints. And different versions of this and other funerals said that there were more than one woman that fainted. So that's part of the emotion of that. The New York Times noted that few of the mourners knew Mr. Beilis personally, but his career was familiar to almost all of them. And here's Eldridge Street. When the casket, draped in black, was carried into the synagogue, all jumped to their feet. The casket was placed in the center of the room. The immediate family, it included his wife Esther, his daughters Ray and May, and sons David and Teddy. He had had another son who had passed away in what was then Palestine, seated themselves in an enclosure in front of the pulpit. David Parnas, who is the president of the synagogue, they gave him his name when he knew he had to become president of something. Rabbi Israel, or Idelson of the synagogue, conducted the services, and a cantor, Samuel Kantorov, also maybe chanted the El Malei Rachamim, the prayer for the dead. And it was also repeatedly called one of the largest funerals witnessed on the streets of the Lower East Side. And I can't say that that's true. It really wasn't one of the largest funerals on the Lower East Side. When Jacob Joseph, a rabbi who was brought from Vilna to take charge of the young Orthodox immigrant Jewish community in 1887, 1888, he came because a team of congregations had banded together to bring him over to lead New York Jews and become the chief rabbi, and it was an experiment that had failed miserably for a variety of reasons as early as the 1890s. But when he died in late July of 1902, an estimated 100,000 people showed up for a funeral procession that went through the whole Lower East Side and lasted hours. Shalom Aleichem, when he died in 1916, the great writer, close to 200,000 people came to a funeral procession that began in the Bronx, made its way to Harlem, and then down Manhattan to the Lower East Side, as well into the Education Alliance. Again, 150,000 to 200,000 people, even a gangster. Here's Shalom Aleichem. Even a gangster, Big Jack Zelig, when he died, in 1912, approximately 12,000 people came to his funeral with Talmud Torah children chanting the Psalms as the procession went through. So I'll return to these people and their significance, but I think it's important because it was noted, it was probably described as one of the largest funerals because it was one of the largest that had happened in quite some time. And that has to do with changes in the Eldridge Street Synagogue. It has to do with more broadly with changes in New York and the Jewish population as a whole. So I want to talk a little bit about Eldridge Street and then move on back and changes on the Lower East Side, and we'll come back to the funeral and what was said at the funeral. So today we look at Eldridge Street as a landmark, and it is a National Historic Landmark. When it was built in 1887, it was brand new. Of course, and it was an experiment because there had been no synagogue built as a synagogue for East European Jews in New York up to that point. There had been obviously many synagogues spread through the Lower East Side in storefronts that were made into synagogues, or for the bigger congregations, their competitors had churches that were made into synagogues, but this was the first one built as a synagogue. Now today when people visit it, and I urge you all to do this because a lot of this comes to life inside of that building. When people visit it, they're surprised because Eldridge Street, just south of Canal, is really part of today's Chinatown. So you see a synagogue standing in the middle of Chinatown, and people are surprised. But that surprise is important because in many ways, in 1887, when the synagogue opened, people would have been as surprised to see this beautiful synagogue openly proclaiming not only Jewish identity, but the idea that Judaism was here to stay. These were people who were investing a lot of money and a lot of time to create this space for them to be Orthodox Jews. And this was an experiment because no one had given them a guidebook for how to become American Jews. They had brought over Jacob Joseph, but he wasn't able to guide them in their day-to-day lives and answer the questions that they were encountering. So this place was in many ways a place of adaptation. And this is the interior of the synagogue as it's been recreated. And in this place, this is where people figured out how to adapt their orthodoxy to America, and part of that involved learning about America. In 1889, they celebrated the inauguration of George Washington's, the centennial of his inauguration. When they opened, they were waving the flags and the stars and stripes. In 1900, Felix Adler came to talk about the issue of crime in the city, so it was a communal center as well. Felix Adler, as trained as a Reform rabbi, and then someone who left it and formed the Ethical Culture Society, they would have never let this man lead a sermon on the Sabbath. However, they did allow their space to be used as a communal space to deal with issues of the time. So this was also a place where the Orthodox Union had some of its first meetings, the Hebrew Sheltering Association, Hayas, the founders of some of the first Jewish hospitals met here. So again, this is not just a place that was a kind of a place where Jews went to hide and have their orthodoxy, but it was a place where they were actively negotiating an American Jewish identity. And perhaps my favorite story, if you'll indulge me, and I'll get back to Mendel Beilis, I promise. In 1902, the price of kosher meat went up from 12 cents to 18 cents a pound. And immigrant women famously and infamously, and if you look at the English press, organized to demand better prices. And that organization involved speeches, it involved riots, and it involved attacks on butcher stores. It also involved interrupting the Torah services at the Eldridge Street Synagogue in May 17, 1902, a contingent of women entered the synagogue in the middle of services under the idea that you could interrupt Torah services to talk about a matter of social justice. So you can imagine all the people in this congregation dealing with this. And it was complicated because the president of the synagogue was Isaac Gellis, the sausage king, and he was on the other side, right? And so this is a place, and they tried to kind of quell it by David Cohn, who was the forward called real estate Nick, got up and said, don't stop buying kosher meat, maybe just buy half the amount of meat that you would. But the congregation rejected that. They started chanting, kind flesh, no meat, no meat. And you see democracy working its way through this halls. Again, so not a place where people were hiding. So a place where there was adaptation, a place there was cantorial concerts, festivals, raising money to send back to Eastern Europe during World War I. Benefits, there were rites of passage. And here I actually want to make a point about Orthodox and observant Jews working on Saturday. Of course, you're breaking Jewish law, you're breaking halakha if you work on the Saturday, but many of the people who sat in the benches of the synagogue were also people who had to work. And in America, people confronted often a 6-day, 7-day work week in which they had no choice but to work. So one of the most fascinating stories of this time and is this adaptation is how people carved out a Jewish life even when the circumstances were such, the economic and social circumstances were such that it was just a little bit more complicated. My point being, this was a place where adaptation took place. Its heyday, Eldridge Streets, was that of the heyday of the Lower East Side. And so, again, while Mendel Beilis' funeral was not the largest, it was probably one of the largest that had happened for a long time. Eldridge Street by the 1930s was no longer the jewel of East European Jews. People had been moving out. Now, people had been moving out of the Lower East Side ever since the 1890s, 1900s. Even the first president of Eldridge Street moved within a few years to the Upper East Side. But you always had new immigrants coming to replenish those that had moved on. This changes in 1921 and 1924 when Congress passes, in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act, which restricts the number of immigrants that can come in. That changes the fortune of the Lower East Side and the fortune of many, but because that you no longer have new people coming to replenish those who had moved on. So the population of the Lower East Side drops. Between 1920 and 1930, the Jewish population decreases from 260,000 to 100,000, becoming about 5% of New York's Jewish population. Contrast that to in the 1890s when it was about 75% of New York's Jewish population. But the Lower East Side still remains important because although only 39% of the residents were Jewish, 75% of its stores were run by Jews. So there's still a commercial presence that's there. There's still an institutional presence that's there. Landsmannschaft are meeting there. The newspapers are printed there as well. And this is really important, the commercial presence, because the guy who pays for Mendel Beilis' funeral is a man named Morris Kulak, whose cloak manufacturing warehouse is at 41 Eldridge, just a block from the synagogue. In fact, as that procession made its way over to Eldridge Street, the procession would have seen the finials of the Stars of David at the top of Eldridge Street on one side, and they would have also seen the big sign that said Kulak on it, which, if you can see the sign there, no longer has the letters there, but that was actually the sign that said Kulak. So he was a kind of major business presence on the Lower East Side. So though Kulak himself lived in Brooklyn, and in Borough Park, and was a member of a temple in Borough Park, and was a Zionist and a supporter of hospitals in Brooklyn, he pays for a funeral to happen on the Lower East Side, in part maybe because he's close to that geographically, but in terms of his work. But I think it's for another reason. I think it's because the Lower East Side still meant something to the people who had dispersed and who had moved on to other neighborhoods. As they moved on to throughout the boroughs, well, not Staten Island and not Queens, but Brooklyn and the Bronx and Manhattan, the Lower East Side was a common base for many of these people. These neighborhoods represented, the newer neighborhoods represented more economic diversity, ideological diversity to an extent, but they all had come from the Lower East Side. So the funeral offered the sense that even as the Jewish immigrants had spread out, they still desired to be united in certain occasions. And the Mendel Beilis funeral was something they could unite over. On one level, Beilis was neither a political nor a religious figure. He was a folk hero. And on another level, many shared a larger sense of grief at having lost touch with the values he represented, as he had moved on from the spotlight of the trial, as they had moved on from the trial with their own lives. They had forgotten Beilis. At least this was a motif of the funeral and of the press. So as people came, and Idelson led this funeral, and these accounts come from the various reports from the Yiddish press, but if part of the drama to the front page story was the heroic way in which Mendel Beilis survived the blood libel accusation, in turn gaining him worldwide acclaim in the 1910s, by the time of his death in 1934, he was a not-so-successful insurance man, and the tragedy was the Jewish community's failure to support and remember the man once freed. As demonstrated by the extensive and detailed coverage in the Yiddish press at his death, the immigrant population and their children needed a refresher course on Beilis' identity. So all of these newspapers are going over the trial, explaining what had happened 20 years before. An editorial in the Tug reiterated Beilis' importance to the Jewish people and also pointed out the Jewish people's short attention spans. Quote, "He suffered on behalf of everyone and should be remembered by everyone, but we forgot about him." The fact that he died poor and unsuccessful, the Tug claimed, quote, "his personal life was full of sorrow, wandering, anguish, need, and poverty," end quote, showed that he was unable to kind of come to terms with American currents of thought and American pace of life. Further, the fact that the greater community had forgotten him raises the element of guilt about the past and questioning of the future sense of peoplehood. If this great martyr to the Jewish people had survived the blood libel, how could it be that he died poor and forgotten in America? What does that say about the values and allegiances of the Americanizing immigrant community and their children? Idelson's eulogy touched on these points, and several times he moved the congregation and himself to tears. He talked about Beilis' character, the import of his heroism, and emphasized that Beilis' behavior was crucial to the outcome of the case. Idelson directly addressed the congregation, stirring up the guilt that had brought them to the funeral. Quote, "In return, the Jewish people forgot about him, and he continued to suffer." This forgetfulness is something that the Yiddish press, the Morgenjournal Tageblatt, for example, said that the Jewish people remain indifferent, and in several days he will remain only in the history of our sorrows. Basically, they'll forget him as soon as the funeral is over. Idelson was more hopeful. He read this turnout. He read the people in the congregations, their emotions, as a sign of hope. And he presented the occasion as a lesson, as a point at which Jews of all backgrounds could affirm their sense of peoplehood. The Jews could make amends by remembering, quote, "As long as Jewry survives, so will his name and deeds." And then Idelson asked forgiveness from Beilis and called for a creation of a fund for the Beilis family. He emphasized that this was not a fund that should be supported by uptown or downtown, socialists or pious, but rather a fund that, quote, "all Jews could support." So trying to make sense of this funeral is hard because we have we don't have a lot of evidence. We have what the Yiddish press says. We have what the American press says as well. What I could tell from Beilis's autobiography, or memoir rather, was that he wasn't that excited about America. His memoir was written in 1926. He had been in America for over 5 years, but he stops his memoir at the point where he said, I have to leave Palestine, I don't want to leave, I'm going to go to America to see if I can support my family, but then says nothing about being in America. And I wonder about this constant motif about people saying that the Jews in America had forgotten him and so on and so forth, because one thing that struck me was in the back of his memoir, there's an honor list of people who paid to help bring the book to publication. And this is just one of two, there's about 7 pages, and all of these numbers represent Landsmannschaften and Workmen's Circle chapters, individuals and chapters who are giving money to support the book, and there's hundreds of them. So we joke at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum that our development offers going through it trying to find if they'll support us as well. But what you have is this wide range of people, small individuals, right, who have remembered him in 1926. So I'm not sure if this was all about, despite the obituary, if this was all just about forgetting. I also wonder if there was something in Mendel Beilis's life in America, the fact that he didn't relish his time in America, or at least from what I could glean, and that he was not a successful businessman. And I wonder if there were people among the 3,000, the 4,000, and certainly many more Jews who were looking at this, and they too weren't as successful in America as they should be, and that there was something in his inability to adapt to America that was also something that they were identifying with, and that also brought out the emotion. And again, that's pure speculation, but it was something that occurred to me. So I'll end there, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Annie. Now, please come up for the panel discussion, which will last about 25 minutes or so, and then we'll have some questions and answers. Joining us for the panel discussion is Edmund Levin, who is a longtime writer, producer for ABC News, but he's on our panel because of his forthcoming book, A Child of Christian Blood, Murder and Conspiracy in Tsarist Russia, the Beilis Blood Libel, which will be published by Shotgun Books, and his editor is here as well. And I know what it means to have an author on stage. So this is a very nice event. I have read the script of the book. I strongly recommend it to everybody. It's most beautifully written. I'd like to start, since we don't have a great deal of time, by noting what was in some way a motif, at least in Elissa's and Robert's comments, and Annie and Ed, maybe you would have something to say about this as well, which is the persistence of the Beilis trial. Not the trial itself, but the persistence of the accusation of blood libel, the way that it has undergone a transformation in modern times. For instance, I first myself learned of the blood libel in Chicago when I lived there, and I became aware that an aide to the then mayor of Chicago was giving lectures in the black community that Jewish doctors were injecting the AIDS virus into their children, urging parents not to send their children to Jewish doctors. And this happened in the 1980s. But when I went to Moscow in the early 90s, there was a newspaper that took me a little bit by surprise, which said ritual murder or political assassination. And there was a picture of the family of the Tsar. So at the time, the Orthodox Church was debating whether the family of the Romanovs should be canonized, but they could not canonize the Tsar's family until they determined the cause of death. And they could not determine the cause of death until they resolved the question of whether it was ritual murder. Now, the assassination or the execution of the Romanov family took place in July, so it clearly had nothing to do with Pesach. But the man who pulled the trigger and assassinated the Tsar was a Jew, Yakov Yurovsky. And this apparently was enough to give the Orthodox Church 3 years of trouble in trying to determine whether it was ritual murder or not. And this took place in 1993, and the family was not eventually canonized until at least 3 or 4 years after that. A more hideous form of this was manifested during the time of the Doctors' Plot under Stalin in Soviet Russia in 1953, when the entire population of Jews were being held accountable for the accusation that Jewish doctors were poisoning Kremlin leaders. A case that would probably have led to the expulsion of Jews from major cities, if not the incarceration of many Jews, if not the entire Jewish population, in 4 new concentration camps that Stalin had recently built in Russia. So what I'd like to do is really talk about the persistence of this as a basic myth. And Elissa, you said something interesting, I think that's part of this, which is the fear of modernity, the fear of transition into a new world. And somehow keeping a hold of this myth helps people feel comfort in the old world. And I wonder if you might be able to expand on this idea a little bit more, or any other thoughts you might have, or Robert, or anybody.
Okay, since you started with anecdotes, I'll also start with an anecdote, which is something that happened in Vilnius, in Vilna, in 2007, when Vilnius was the capital of European culture. And I was there for a semester, and I had this very interesting encounter. A colleague of mine who teaches at Vilnius University, and remember, Vilnius is, it's not a village, it's a beautiful city it's the capital city of a state in Europe, and Vilnius University, also rather prestigious university in the Baltic states for certain, and I met a colleague who teaches early modern Jewish history at Vilnius University. She's not Jewish, of course, she's teaching mostly to non-Jewish students, and it's a time of Passover, and she thought, I will bring to class some matzah, so that students, taste it, see what it is, and she says that she's telling me that out of 40 students, only 4 tasted the matzah, and very naively, I looked at her and I asked why, and she looked at me and she said, "Why are you asking why? You study the Jews of Eastern Europe. You should know." And then I had this look of shock on my face because I hadn't realized. And I mean, this is just an anecdote, but actually there is some ethnographic research that has been conducted in Ukraine recently by an ethnographer, maybe Bob knows of him, Lvov, who has just, in 2010, 2011, has, interviewed Ukrainians who mostly live in smaller cities, and asked them about, what do you know about this, this idea that Jews might might kill Christians, Christian children, reenacting the killing of Christ because they need the blood, and most of the people he interviewed actually said, no, we don't believe that the Jews kill Christians. They no longer kill. They used to do that. They don't do. Now they just need a drop of blood. So that there still is that, that idea that there is the need of that quintessential ingredient. If you don't have that drop of blood, you can't have matzah. But just to get back to the question about modernity and urbanization, I mean, if we look as a historian, let me just go back to 1913. What is so interesting, 1911, 1913, in Russia, and I think what makes the Beilis affair and the Beilis trial so unique compared to other trials, in terms of, by the way, in parenthesis, in terms of prosecution, Jews being prosecuted or being accused and prosecuted for ritual murder, I think Hillel Kival who's a major historian of the blood libel, has shown that between the late 1890s up until the 1910s, there were approximately 100 cases. But to go back to the Beilis affair, what makes it so different, I think, is really the role of the Russian legal system that puts its stamp really on the fact that there is such a crime. Jews do engage in such a crime. We don't have it elsewhere. And it really, the accusation makes sense because of this fear of modernity, because of the fear of something that is changing. Russia goes through this radical change in the 1890s. Am I speaking too long? You should interrupt me because, in the 1890s with industrialization, urbanization, thousands of peasants move into the cities, and in the cities where Jews live, in the Pale of Settlement, they do encounter Jews, and in certain areas, especially with the rise of the factories, industrialization, Jews are the ones who have the money, and so you do have this kind of the rise of the Jews, so to speak, and the loss of a certain idea of of what was familiar before this, before urbanization.
So picking up on this a little bit. And Robert, maybe you would know about this. You spoke about the fact that at this time the trial was perceived as a shanda for the Russian state. Well, the Russian state, the Russian nation, had since the beginning of the century been unraveling in a variety of different ways. And the Russo-Japanese War, which was also in some way attributed, the failure of it in some way attributed to the Jews, was a very key ingredient in this. But I wonder the extent to which the judgment about the decision about Beilis might in fact have had something to do with a backlash against the Tsar. Do you think that was did that play a role in this at all? I think it's on.
Oh, okay. Repeat it one more time, just the end part.
Well,
so I get it
Beilis
right.
is exonerated.
Right.
To more or less. The Jewish people are not, but Beilis is. To what extent might it have been the case that Russians were themselves angry at the czarist system and were, not all of course, but some, were actively trying to bring that regime into further disrepute?
No doubt. There were many Russian political groups on the left, liberals, who wanted to undermine the autocracy and pushed constantly for more reforms and wanted to transform the parliament, the Duma, into a genuinely functioning parliamentary system. And they kept running up, and the problem was that the regime itself resisted further change. Mm-hmm. I think there might be a case made for the thinking of those officials who supported the prosecution of Beilis as a way to demonstrate to the world that Russia isn't such a bad place, in the sense that if we can have a jury adjudicate this murder and find a Jew guilty, then we can perhaps feel more secure in our policies towards Jews if we can say, look, we had a trial, the jury found him guilty, so our policies are justified. We have to be suspicious of the Jews.
So the Beilis trial was part of a larger game.
I would think so for some of those officials, Minister of Justice, Minister of Interior. I mean, not all high-ranking officials were aware of what was going on.
Right.
I don't know if Nicholas II himself knew that this was a conspiracy. He followed the trial closely, but he probably believed, oh, this is interesting. Maybe Jews really do engage in this kind of behavior, and if so, we need to know, and the world should know. But that's a lot of speculation. We can't really get inside.
There's no real documentation. Ed, in your research, did you find new things either about this, the larger context of the Beilis trial, or things about Beilis himself that were particularly new or fresh for you?
Well, just about Nicholas II, he was on record as making one comment about the Beilis trial. He said, he agreed with the verdict that Beilis was innocent, but there is such a crime as ritual murder. Other historians have argued that really part of the game here was Tsarist officials trying to please Nicholas II because he wanted, the court system operated according to Western norms. Nicholas saw Russia as a non-Western country, and he wanted to define Russia as non-Western. He had a well-known fascination and obsession with the 17th century, and had a famous masked ball where everyone dressed up in 17th century costume. So for various historians like Richard Wortman has argued that really was part of Tsarist officials trying to define Russia as defying Western norms, much as perhaps you could say Russia is doing today in some ways, trying to define themselves against the West. Also, if I can just make one comment that Elissa mentioned, there was a wave of blood libel cases in Western Europe at the end of the 19th century. So this was a pan-European phenomenon. There were actually a half dozen trials. Now, they were local affairs, and what distinguishes the Beilis trial is that it had the backing of a central government and perhaps the ruler. That was not the case in other countries, but there were half dozen trials. There was one in Hungary, in Bohemia, there was one in Königs in Germany in 1900, and a number of these cases were accompanied by anti-Semitic riots. So I don't think there's any historical consensus on what the nature of these cases was, but there was clearly some kind of ferment. And in a sense, we should recall that the blood libel originated in the West, not in Russia. It actually originated in the ritual murder charge originated in England, and the blood libel itself in Germany in the 13th century. So it was a Western phenomenon. And Russia, in a way, was kind of broadcasting back to the West its own ideas. They relied on pseudo-scholarship that was mainly generated in the West.
Russian nationalists today like to point out that Marxism also was a Western phenomenon. But they improved it. I do have another question, though, and it has to do with the American reaction to the Beilis trial. And if I'm right in this, I think Beilis was a little disappointed by America in this. Could you, maybe Annie and Ed, maybe talk about this a little bit? What was the nature of the American response, and what was at the bottom of it, and so forth?
Well, Beilis was a little bit disappointed in the help he got after the trial, but if I can talk about before the trial, what surprised me, one of the things that surprised me was the confused and response of the American Jewish leadership at the Beilis trial. It was very, very tentative, and actually, in anticipation of possibly being asked this, I pulled out a few quotes. A leading Jewish Reform rabbi of the era, Max Heller, near the end of the trial, wrote in an article called "Statesmanship" in the Jewish Advocate. He said, "Has the Jewish people ever afforded the world a more doleful and piteous spectacle of disunion and disorder than what it is presenting right now?" Now, there were a great deal of demonstrations across the United States. Many Christian clergymen protested against the Beilis case. There were a lot of demonstrations. But I think what Heller talking about here, I think he has in mind, he doesn't mention, he's talking about the American Jewish Committee, which never came out with a public statement. I just got some documents actually after the book went to press, unfortunately, but I do talk about it a bit in the book. They never really figured out what to do, and a theme in the Jewish response in general to things, when something bad happens to a Jew and becomes a public issue, but Jewish leaders wonder, well, what should we do? Are we going to do more harm than good by speaking up? So you have some sympathy with the American Jewish Committee, but I just have a couple of quotes here. I mean, I just got these documents. In February 9th, 1912, Jacob Schiff, financier, very well-known Jewish leader of the day, he writes to Herbert Friedenwald, secretary of the American Jewish Committee, and says, "We ought to do something, particularly in terms of having a protest made by a leading Christian clergyman." And they go back and forth, and then 4 days later, Jacob Schiff writes to Friedenwald, the secretary of the American Jewish Committee, "I had a talk with Judge Sulzberger yesterday." He's one of the committee leaders. "Upon discussion, we came to the conclusion that it would be best not to do anything in the way of an American protest against the Russian ritual agitation, as for obvious reasons, this might bring forth discussions which would be better to avoid." And it becomes clear in the correspondence that what he means is, the ritual murder charge was not really well known in America, and he was afraid of stirring the pot by even raising the subject. Friedenwald responded. At some point, he wrote, "Yes, the charge of ritual murder means nothing to the American mind," and he wanted it to stay that way. Eventually, toward the end of the trial, they organized a petition of Christian clergymen sent to the Tsar. And that was about it. Now, there were a lot of demonstrations. There was an amazing demonstration in Chicago, which was headlined by Jane Addams and Booker T. Washington, but it had nothing to do with the American Jewish leadership. There were thousands of people gathered in the Chicago Loop, so many that they had originally booked one theater, but it filled up, and they had to get the doors open of the George M. Cohan Grand Opera House and filled it up. And Booker T. Washington, Jane Addams, other well-known figures of the day, and also I think the mayor of Chicago sent a message. It was a big, big deal. So he did get a lot of support, although after the trial, Beilis was disappointed in the monetary support he got, although he did certainly get some.
And just to contextualize that, too, the response is a common pattern that you can trace to the 1840, to the Damascus affair, the Martara affair in 1858, where American Jewish leadership is unsure what to do. It's not that they don't care, but there is a sense of, if we have something public, if we have a huge demonstration, is that going to cause more problems? And that there was a belief and a practice that using diplomacy, using more quiet kind of intervention might help. So that you'll see throughout. And for example, in 1908, a police commissioner said that Jews of New York, that Jews were accounted for, I think 75% of crime in New York, a huge number of crime. The downtown Jews wanted to get out there and demonstrate and march, but it was the AJC uptown that says, no, we'll take care of this through our means. And so you you see this happen over and again, and I just wanted to point out too, in the same time that the Beilis affair is happening, you have the Leo Frank trial as well, so that's something at home that's going on. And Hazia Diner, who's a wonderful historian of American Jewish history, had just gone to Atlanta to give a talk about that, and in her preparation for that talk found that the American Jewish Yearbook has so much mention of Beilis over and over again. Leo Frank is like a sentence or a half a sentence. So there was even in some ways less going on in Leo Frank in terms of public.
Yeah, and they had the American Jewish Committee had very similar discussions about the Frank case. If we do something, if we raise a protest, is that going to hurt him? And it was you sympathized with them. It was a totally legitimate concern.
And of course, by the early 1930s, a considerable segment of the American population embraced anti-Semitic and even Nazi ideology. The Ivy League schools had Nazi officials come to state their case to the students. And I wonder the extent to which that fact might have influenced both the latter years of Mendel Beilis in America and the memory of the Beilis trial.
Yeah, and also the same in the JTA kind of reports that of Beilis's death and his funeral. The next article is what's going on in Nazi Germany, and so that's also, I think, looming. And that in the eulogy, they're also talking about things are happening in other parts of the world, and that this isn't over. So I think that was very much that, maybe even more than the quotas at the university, but the kind of the fear of what's going on throughout the world. Yeah.
Robert, you said something, and maybe we would close with this thought, that Beilis understood that it wasn't just he who was on trial, it was the Jewish people on trial. That's an amazing thing it's easy for us in hindsight to say that, but for a person to understand his historical role is really quite amazing, and I wonder if you would say a few words about that.
Well, that is an interesting question, but the quote, that comes from his autobiography to some extent, and so he had a little bit of time to reflect on what his incarceration, his trial, and so on meant or signified. But on the other hand, he was aware at the time that if he killed himself in jail, this would look bad for the Jewish community. And that, I think, does speak to his awareness of the larger picture of, the plight of Russian Jewry at the time, and his ability, as limited as it was, because he didn't have any information given to him for a while. He spent 6 months in prison without any idea what was going on.
Was he aware of this from the standpoint of needing to prove his innocence, or was it also connected to the need to prove his dignity as a human being?
Well, certainly his innocence. I recall reading something where he was told by some official that there was going to be a pardon of all criminals. And according to this account, Beilis said, no, essentially I want a trial to demonstrate that I'm not a criminal, that I am innocent. So I think he wanted to have himself acquitted, but also I think he's aware that the Jewish community as a whole is on trial in a sense, just as the captions say, Beilis innocent, but Jewish community guilty.
Right.
Just one comment about that. During the trial, Beilis didn't obviously get a chance to talk about himself as being kind of a stand-in for the Jewish people, but there was one moment that he remarks on in his autobiography. His first words, he's asked a number of questions, which everybody was asked, and one of the questions was, what is your religion? Everyone was asked that because it was just part of the standard court procedure, had no particular significance, no anti-Semitic significance, but judge asked him, are you a Jew? And he said, yes, a Jew, and he said it very loudly. And in his memoir, he said it so loudly it felt like it wasn't his own voice. And he said it more loud than the judge. And sometimes you doubt, well, could that be true? Is that accurate? And then indeed, I went back to newspaper accounts, and it was widely commented on. how he said, yes, a Jew, in a very loud, loud voice, so that it could be heard. And I think expressed his feeling at the time about how he felt.
So I think that concludes our panel discussion, and I'd like to begin our questions by asking Jay Beilis, please to stand up and be acknowledged, and other members of the Beilis family who are here with us tonight. And Jay, I'd like to open this part of our evening with any comment or question that you might have.
Where do I start? Professor Bob mentioned that Professor Bob mentioned that if the trial had taken place at this time, there might be a movie and such. But the thing is that nobody would believe it. Standard court procedure at the end of testimony is for a judge to give what they call a charge to the jury, and the charge that the judge gave to the jury was everything you've heard, that you should disregard everything you've heard for the last 5 weeks. All that you need to know is that a Jew is being put on trial for killing a child, a Christian child. So I mean, that's just the start of it. And as far as like the mention of Dreyfus, the thing is, my grandfather, first of all, Dreyfus had, what was the writer's name? Zola, had Zola, which really helped to put the story out in the forefront. My grandfather didn't have anything like that. And also my grandfather he just wanted to go back to his family. He didn't want to be part of history. When he came to this country, he was offered money to sit in the window of a bank and wave to people as they walked by, and it's something that he didn't want to exploit. And also, I believe, again, Professor Bob mentioned that there was the train had stopped, and they were going to name the station Beilis Station, and also I think it was a colonel, it wasn't a captain, that was assigned to stay outside my grandfather's house, that he kidded with my grandfather that he would be able to retire early from all the bribes he was taking from people who were coming by to visit my grandfather to say hello. So I mean, in all of this, there's really, there is a touch of humor. And as far as like the Beilis case and what it means today, the three of us, Ed and Bob, were recently in Kiev. We were invited for the 100th anniversary of my grandfather's trial. Unfortunately, we didn't get to go by and see Yushkinsky's grave. There was a logistic issue there. But one point I did make is that, sure, this trial began in the 12th century and it's an ongoing case and all, but, tomorrow morning in countries like Saudi Arabia, Muslim kids are going to school learning that Jews do things like this, which is like really it's really a horrible thing to think that this is actually being taught in schools. And also, people also say, as far as like an ongoing case, we briefly spoke about people spoke about the Eldridge Synagogue. There was the 125th anniversary a few years ago, and we went to speak there, and I got to speak for a few minutes, and I said, what's really important to me as far as being the grandson is that people would come to my father, say 50 years ago, and say, we left all these different countries after my grandfather's trial, saving them from places like Babi Yar and the Shoah in the general, because one of the, again, Sholem Alechin's name was mentioned, and that shortly after the trial, Sholem Alechin came to visit my grandfather's house and told him the weight of 12 million Jews were on his shoulders for every day that he was in prison, and we know what happened to half of them. So, I mean, that's, as far as being the grandson of Mendel Beilis, that's what means the most to me, that people escaped all these different areas. So as far as comparing it to Dreyfus, I don't know if that really occurred with Dreyfus, but I believe it occurred with my grandfather. And even in the Kiev thing, we had just a month ago, people came up to me afterwards and said they left their families told them they left all different parts of Europe after I got my grandfather's trial. So that's really means the most to be the grandson of Mendel Beilis.
Thank you very much. And Jay, why don't you come and sit here, because people may want to ask you some questions. I'll move over there.
So we have time for a couple of questions.
Yes, this Lady.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here, wait, 1 second.
I said, I'm glad is this on? Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Zola and the Dreyfus case, and picking up on what Elissa said at the beginning about the anxiety about and terror of modernity. I wonder if it isn't important to distinguish those cases by noting that the Dreyfus case took place in what was already a secular society. And all of the societies that held on to blood libels, it seems to me, did not have a separation of church and state. So that the power of the church, whether it's the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church, in the modern period is both contested and enduring, whereas in Western Europe at that point, most of those countries were much more emphatically secular. So,
Can I just say one thing about on still? Yeah. Just one thing about Leo Frank. 6-7 years ago, a gentleman who since passed away because he was a scientist at Chernobyl and ended up with brain cancer, came to me and wanted to translate my grandfather's book, which we just republished, translated into Russian. And during some of the publicity and taking the pictures going to the cemetery, one of his friends went over to the office of the cemetery and says, "Look, I see you have a guide of famous people that are buried here in the cemetery. My grandfather is buried less than 100 meters from Leo Frank." He says, "I see you have Leo Frank's name here in your brochure of famous Jews buried in the cemetery, but how come you don't have Beilis?" And they told him, "Oh, come on, how could you compare? You can't compare the two." And I really do say, how can you compare? I mean, I understand, Leo Frank, and I'm prejudiced, of course, that, Leo Frank occurred in this country. But again, getting back to what Sholem Aleichem said to my grandfather, you really can't compare the two cases.
Elissa, did you have something?
Yep, it's on. This is an interesting observation that you made, Carol. It's something I have to think about. Just two things that I'll just spit out. That we do have Émile Zola in France, but in Russia we do have Maxim Gorky, who maybe isn't, worldwide as famous as Zola, just because his work hadn't been translated, but he is, a very important voice who was very vocal in terms of defending Beilis, as well as Korolenko, who was a very well-known writer at the time. In terms of division of state, church and state, it's a very interesting point that I need to think about to say something intelligent. I just want to say that it was very hard for the prosecutors to find a Russian Orthodox priest to come and serve as a chief witness, right? So they had to rely on a Catholic priest, on Pranaitis, who was a defrocked Catholic priest, which is interesting. But that's all I can spit out right now. Maybe Bob can.
Getting back to the Dreyfus case. Some people look at the case as a conflict in the 1890s between the forces for change and the reactionary forces and the church, the military, government, using Dreyfus as a way to try to limit the impact of secularization on French society. So while there may have been separation of church and state, though, and freedom of religious freedom, it's not as if the church was powerless at the time, and certainly played a role in French politics at the time. Maybe didn't have the sanction of the Russian government would have over Russian Orthodoxy, but nonetheless it did play a role, I think, in the Dreyfus affair. And also one other point, the blood libel in the Russian Empire comes from the West. There is no real tradition in Russian Orthodoxy regarding the blood libel, and the blood libel really appears in the late 18th century when the Russian Empire acquires a lot of territory that had, lots of Jews, but also Catholics.
Since since every question will get 3 answers, we do have to move on. That gentleman in the back, please.
Did when Bernard Malamud's book, The Fixer, came out, did that revive or change the discussion? What happened when that came out?
Quickly. When Bernard Malamud's book, The Fixer, came out, which is based on the Beilis Trial, which is evident and overtly known, did it change or revise the understanding of the case? Is that right?
Malamud didn't really acknowledge that the book was completely based on the Beilis case. He mentioned it as one of a number of sources, and something tells me Jay may have something to say about this. And there was a book published around the same time by Maurice Samuel about the case, so there was a brief burst of interest, but that was about it. Mm-hmm. But Malamud did not really certainly push the book as being about the Beilis case.
Yeah. Yes, right there. Yes, sir.
It would appear that it wouldn't be a stretch for this jury to have found him not guilty, to have found him guilty. Why didn't the jury? What was the context?
I could not hear your.
What do you speculate about as to why the jury found him not guilty? Why didn't they find him guilty? Why didn't they? Okay. What would have happened if they did find him guilty? Where did they?
I wouldn't be sitting here if they found him guilty. I doubt my father would have met my mother.
I can understand that, but I'm just saying is. In that system where they ignore the facts and the facts.
I think there's a record related to this. So
there was really no evidence. There was no evidence. That's why they kept putting off. It took them 2 years to get their act together and really try to come up with a plan, but there was no evidence. I mean, what Bob mentioned, and I also mentioned the fact that he's, Beilis, the murder took place on a Saturday, and Beilis, was working, but most importantly, the local policemen, investigators had already connected, the archives. It's very clear that there was. Such clear evidence that it was the criminal gang of Vera Shibriak who had carried out the murder.
Even so, there was just one vote.
Yeah. Right, yes.
At the last minute.
At the last minute by, as I understand it, a peasant rather than an intellectual. Yes. Yes, sir.
Henry Heine's short story, The Rabbi from Bachrach. I think that had a big influence on people who read German literature, and it was translated into so many languages.
Okay. Yes, in the black.
Yes, that is me. Hi, my name is Elissa. I have very quick question, 2 words for Edmund Levin. When does your book come out?
It's coming out in February.
Okay, thank you. And then my question is directed to Jay. So I know that you and Jeremy Garber and Mark Stein have written a publication on the potential idea that some of Bernard Malamud's The Fixer was, even though it is fictional, that some of it was actually plagiarized, I believe. And also, maybe that's something that you will be discussing sometime in the near future. I don't know if you could give me some feedback.
That conversation did take place already at Dartmouth at another conference. It's a very interesting story as I remember it.
And will be taken again at Cardozo next weekend. But it was a paper that Jeremy and I wrote 20 years ago, just the comparisons between the 2 books, and dozens of examples where Malamud plagiarized my grandfather's story.
Thank you.
Yeah,
My question is for anyone on the panel, and it could be only one answer is sufficient. Could you comment about the circumstances which brought Beilis to the United States, and tell us the year as well?
He came to the United States, I believe, in 1921. He had gone to Palestine, but then found himself in need of funds, and there was, according to the autobiography, monies that had been promised to him that hadn't made their way to him, and he repeatedly talks about, as has been mentioned, that he didn't want to exploit his name or do things, but he didn't have a choice. Really, when you look in the memoir, he really writes, or the autobiography, he writes about how he was only going to New York. And at first, he really even wanted to go to New York just to make some money and then go back, but wasn't able to do that. And even his children, he said, didn't want him to leave. They wanted to stay, or some of them wanted to stay, so that you really get the sense that he's leaving out of deep reluctance to come to New York. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the memoir does not talk about New York at all, or America after that point. So even though he had been in America 5 years before writing that, he doesn't say anything about that, which I think is interesting. And then I found also another 20 years after the trial, he spoke to a reporter saying that he never loved America. He didn't like the pace of America, and he would have preferred to have stayed in Palestine.
One more question. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have something?
No.
Okay, one more question. Let's see. Oh, yeah. All right, man back there.
Two-side comments. A recent article in History Today this past month is devoted to how Russia in 1913 had turned its back on its medievalism and was making at the level of the central government, a dramatic turn into modernity. I suggest all of you read it. It's revisionist, but I think it might change some of the comments that you've made.
May I ask who wrote it?
I didn't suggest that.
I think that's an important detail.
It's last month's History Today. It's easy to find. The other is that, for our writer of the book, is that in the biography of Jacob Schiff, in about 1904, during the Japanese War, Schiff is approached for a loan by the Russian Tsarist government, and it's written in that biography that he asked the Tsar to reverse his policies regarding anti-Semitism, and the Tsar refused, and Jacob Schiff in turn refused on that basis to engage in a loan, as independently did all of the other major Jewish banking houses. But they did it, and at least this is what's stated in Schiff's biography, without consulting with each other, because they did not wish to give any backing to the myth of the international Jewish monopoly of conspiracy against the world domination.
Does anyone want to respond to this? Robert, maybe you might have.
Clearly, they all thought alike, so they didn't need to coordinate, I guess.
Okay. All right. That being the case, we do have time for one last question, if it is a question. So please make it a question. Mordecai.
What year was your father born? My father? Yeah. 1903.
That was too simple. Okay, in the back.
And died in what year? My father or my grandfather?
1934.
1934.
1934.
Elissa, you mentioned something. You quoted the prosecutorial rant about Jewish domination and all, and quoted them as saying that Jews controlled all the media in Russia. Was there any truth behind that rant? Was there any Jewish media, so to speak, in Russia that might have been based on?
I think I might need the support of Bob here, but as far as I know, especially in Russia, that wasn't the case. You do have some Jewish journalists who write for the more moderate Russian newspapers, but it's usually, if you have if your name is Gruzenberg, you will not be, your article would probably not be published in the Kiev-Lanin, for example. So it's very interesting, this idea, if we talk about modern anti-Semitism, how this idea of Jews really dominating the media, which in a way, there is an element of truth in Germany at that time, and this is one of the major arguments that is made by political anti-Semites, but we can't really see that. So it's interesting how this idea migrated into Russia. And I don't know if you want to add anything.
The Jews did not play a major role in publishing.
But
yeah, in 1939, Meyerhold was arrested because they thought he was a Jew. He was a German. But this charge of the Jews taking hold of the media and dominating the press and the arts and so forth was resurrected in 1951 by the KGB in its interrogations of the doctors, and was going to be a key element in the trial if it ever happened. It did not happen because Stalin died, but it was definitely going to be a key element, and it was going to be admitted to by two major figures in the KGB itself who were Jewish at the time.
Just one last point to go back to the question, which is a very interesting question. Actually, Oskar Viper, who I'm writing about right now, what happened to him actually after the revolution. There was a huge trial against him set up by the Bolsheviks as one of the main spokesmen in the prosecution. And it's very interesting that the way in which he speaks about the press, it's not only the press, it's the Russian language press, meaning he's also referring to Jews who are in New York who are writing in Russian. So it's not only Russia per se, it's also, the communities of Russian Jews. Of course, it's Jews, it's not Russians, ethnically speaking.
Unfortunately, I think we have to end now. Thank you all very, very much for coming, and thank you to all our panelists.